But again, thank you all for coming. Our next program here is Brian Fox Ellis playing one of the founders of Bishop Hill, Jonas Olson.
Har gott gott vara, och vad livet dakar hund, humlen sulum fören frala, har gott gott vara. It is wonderful to be living. Life is marvelous to behold. Flocks of birds are gleefully singing. Grass is growing green and bold. Hear the bumblebees buzzing. See the butterfly in flight. Out of nectar-filled little petals, flowers toast us to our delight. It is wonderful to be living here in Bishop Hill. The grass is growing green and bold, so the cows produce the best cream. And the dairy maids are happy, no? My name is Jonas Olson, and it is a great honor to be here at the semi-demi-septicentennial. It was the 50th anniversary that I last delivered this speech on the history of the founding of this town, Bishop Hill. I will speak to you of our voyages from Sweden, the origins of the devotionalist movement, our building of this great city. Though I know that some of you just want to hear about the murder of Erik Janson, and I will tell you about the murder. But first, please, allow me to share with you our fondest memories. I was born in Sweden in 1809, the same year that Abraham Lincoln was born. And my father was a farmer, but my father was a drunk. As a boy, I fled home and I moved to Stockholm for a short while. I would fish in Soderala. I would harvest salmon from the Baltic. And then I would bring them to Stockholm to sell. And I soon learned that if I smoked the fish first, I could sell it at a better price. And I did well. It was there in Stockholm that I met George Scott, who was the first Swedish Methodist, an industrialist that built a plant, and he brought a Swedish Methodist with him from England to help us to learn more about Methodism. My father passed. There's no doubt that alcohol had much to do with his early demise. And so I was called home to take over the family farm. It was about this time that the Lazar, the readers, the devotionalist movement began to grow. You might have trouble understanding this, but if you were living in Sweden when I was, that you must attend the Lutheran church. You could be fined or imprisoned if you did not tithe the church, like a tax. The church and the state were very much together, and it was forbidden to read the Bible and think for yourself. You must be careful with people who think for themselves. But we would meet in our homes because Martin Luther had translated the Bible into German. And the Gutenberg press meant that it could be printed. And eventually was translated into Swedish. And so we were called the readers. And at first the church looked the other way. We preferred devotionalist because we came to church. We willingly paid our tithe. We attended in good numbers. And the church ignored the fact that we would meet and we would read and we would discuss the meaning of the most holy word for ourselves. But then a young man was traveling the countryside. I'll never forget the first time that I met Erik Janson. He was known as the Wheat Flour Messiah. And he came to Hälsingland, where I lived, because he knew that the devotionalist movement was strong. And he arrived on a Saturday night, and of course I welcomed him to stay in my home. We said a prayer before dinner, and we went to church the next morning. And after church, my sister asked to purchase some wheat flour, and he scolds her, his host. He said, "This is the Lord's day, and I shall not do business on this day. Ask me tomorrow, and you will get what you want." Well, that evening, again at supper, we gathered, we prayed, and we feasted. And after supper, he scolds me. He says, "You are the head of this household. Why do you not call your family to prayer morning, noon, and night?" The word stung. But he was right. It was my responsibility to make sure that my family, we worshiped the Lord and sang the praises morning, noon, and night. My mother encouraged me, and my first wife. But she passed in childbirth. Later, getting ahead of myself just a little, I married Karen Wexel, and we had 2 daughters, and I understand that they still live here in Bishop Hill. You know the Wexels. But that is not the story I meant to tell. I was enamored with Erik, for he traveled broadly, selling wheat flour. He was allowed to travel. And when it was at first 5 or 10 or 15 who gathered in parlors to listen to him preach, to sing the hymns together, the church ignored him. But when dozens and then eventually hundreds began to gather, the church could not ignore him. He began to burn books. Not any book. He burned the devotional books the Lutheran Church wrote to tell us when to pray and what to pray and how to pray. He burned the hymnals, and the church could no longer ignore him. He told me his story often. He preached this story, how he was afflicted with a terrible rheumatoid arthritis. His joints, they ached. And one day he was riding his horse, and he fell from his horse. And he lay there, wallowing in the dirt. And he prayed, "Lord, take me. I cannot live like this." And he felt like a lightning bolt through his whole body. As he crawled up onto his knees and he began to pray, he heard a voice. And he knew it was the voice of God. Ask and you shall receive. If your faith is strong enough, nothing is impossible in the eyes of our Lord. And he prayed even more fervently to be forgiven for his lack of faithfulness. And he felt that electricity, and he stood up. And he never felt that pain again. And so he fell back to his knees, and he prayed in gratitude, offering his life in service to the Word, in service to our Lord. And that is when he began to travel and preach. But as more and more people gathered to hear him, the church could no longer ignore it. I remember one evening we were in the meeting house, our friend's parlor, and the authorities came to arrest him. They interrupted our prayers, and they said, "Are you Erik Janson?" And he stood up and said, "I am." "Then you are the man we are looking for." And as they went to arrest him, I stood up. Now, I am, as you can see, not a very large man. But I stood up with the force of God behind me. And then others stood up. And we walked towards the deputies. And we said, "You have no business here. I shall care for Erik Janson." And as we walked towards them, we slowly pushed them out of the parlor. And they left us that time. Another time, Erik was arrested. And as he was being taken to jail, we arranged to have several men on horseback interrupt the progress of the carriage. And as they created a distraction, others of us came up behind and we stole Erik Janson from the carriage. And we secreted him away. Later, he dressed as a woman and he cross-country skied from Sweden over the mountains to Norway, because he knew there was a bounty on his head. I had friends in Stockholm. George Scott, the Swedish Methodist and the industrialist. And so I arranged to hire a lawyer. And I met with the King of Sweden. And the King of Sweden decided he would not pursue Erik. He would let him go as long as he was gone and did not come back into Sweden. But then we were faced with a terrible choice. Would you go back to the Lutheran Church, which you have disavowed? Or would you follow this prophet to the New World? This is not a rhetorical question. How many of you would go? How many of you would stay? I sold my family farm. I paid for my wife, my children. I even paid for the hired hands and those who could not afford their own passage. And we sailed from Galva. Vi sålde våra hemmen, vi sålde våra hemmen, vi sålde våra hemmen. We sold our homes in Sweden and sailed away from friends. Like the bird that wings on southward when summer slowly ends, they return in the springtime to nest upon the strand. But we will never once again see our dear motherland. No, we will never once again see our dear motherland. Vi sold våra hemmen, vi sold våra hemmen, we sold our homes in Sweden. 6 ships sailed, several from Stockholm, others from Gävle. We sailed across the North Sea, across the North Atlantic, and we arrived in New York City. The moment we got down off the ship, we fell to our knees and prayed that we had traveled safely. We found out later that one of the ships went down off the coast of Nova Scotia and did not arrive so safely. We went to church, and the preacher, we found out, had locked the door. And he went on with an interminable sermon. But we had already purchased tickets on a boat, a steamboat that would take us up the Hudson River. And time was approaching for us to board. And the preacher resumed his interminable sermon. And so we began to sing in Sweden, in Swedish. Vi sålde våra hemmen. All together. Vi sålde våra hemmen. We grew louder and louder until eventually he unlocked the door and encouraged us to leave. We took a steamboat up the Hudson River to Albany, New York. We boarded a canal boat on the Erie Canal that had recently opened. We followed the Erie Canal from Albany to Buffalo. We boarded another boat that took us across Lake Erie, Lake St. Clair, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan to Chicago. And then we walked from Chicago to here. It had taken most of the spring and summer. It was already early fall by the time we arrived. This was the Western Wilderness. The food that we had brought with us on our journey, we had consumed along the way. And there were no farmers to sell us provisions, and winter was fast approaching. Right here, you see this sycamore tree. You see the culverts. Here was a gully. From the administrative building all the way across, it continues to the Edwards River. My little brother, Olaf Olson, he had gone ahead as a scout. When he arrived in New York City, he met Reverend Hellstrom. Reverend Hellstrom said he had a brother who lived in Victoria, another Reverend Hellstrom. The first Swedish Methodist church in Illinois is just south of here. Reverend Hellstrom said there's good property to the north. Rich prairie soil, an oak grove with timber, the Edwards River, which would provide year-round water. And so we purchased more than 20 acres as the Red Oak Grove. And we came. But that first winter, we dug into the walls of the gully. We made man-made caves. We put a log front and a hole in the back so we could have a fire, and the smoke drawn out that hole would draw heat through this dugout. Erik began to preach fasting because we had run out of provisions. And didn't Moses fast in the desert? And Jesus when he went to the mountain? And then he began to fast celibacy. We could not feed ourselves. We could not afford to bring others into the community. Several young people, they said, we did not sign on for celibacy, and they moved to Chicago. And they left. But not only did we survive the winter, though nearly 70 died of starvation and privation, most of us survived. And one of the first buildings we built was a log cabin church in the field just over here. And eventually, we built the church that you see standing there. It is the heart and soul of the community. There were 2 layers of apartments on the ground floor and the first floor, and the sanctuary above. We had learned to make brick from I believe it was a German or an English immigrant, and we set up our own brick mill. There's fine clay in the valley of the Edwards River. And young women helped to cut and to mold the brick, and we fired them in the grill, fired them in the kiln, and you can see the brick structures that were built. More than 1 million bricks were made to build all of these fine buildings. The administration buildings where commerce was done. The carpenter shop where we made furniture and the boxes for the wagons. The blacksmith and wagon hall where we put the wagons together. We sent emissaries to Pleasant Plains, Kentucky to study the Shaker communities. And the Shakers sold us cattle that were acclimated to the Midwestern temperatures. Cattle who could tolerate the heat of summer and the cold winters. But most important, they sold us seed for growing broom corn and the first device for making brooms, which we were able to replicate. And eventually, we planted more than 7,000 acres in broom corn and made thousands and thousands of brooms every year. We planted flax and made linen. We made miles of rugs. We built a hotel. And the general store was more of a showcase. So when businessmen came from as far away as Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, they could stay at the hotel. They could see the goods that we had made. And they could order hundreds of rugs that are still made here at the Prairie Arts Center. Brooms you can still acquire today. We were the economic engine of Henry County. When cholera came, we knew that we must divide. We must separate because it is a highly communicable disease. And if you stay a certain distance apart, you're less likely to share that disease. We had fishing camps in Chillicothe, Illinois, along the Illinois River because we were fishermen from the Baltics. We had fishing camps at Rock Island. And so several community members moved there. We owned more than 14,000 acres. And so we moved to the 4 corners of the community. We only lost 128 to cholera, and most of us survived. But the doctor that we had hired, he took advantage. He insisted that he paid in livestock and not in the script, the paper money that we had printed. And he cured no one. It was about this time that a young man moved here by the name of John Root. John Root may or may not have been AWOL from the Swedish military. We know he was a riverboat gambler. He may or may not have been a scoundrel. But we do know, when he saw the way that we work together, all in common, to support the community, he thought maybe he could live more easily. He also thought that if he married the niece of the founder, Charlotta, Erik's niece, he would be in with the leader of the community. But before Erik allowed his niece to marry, he made John Root sign an agreement. I think you would call a prenuptial agreement. That if he wanted to leave, and she wanted to stay, she could stay. When the cholera came, I have empathy for this man. He kidnapped his wife and child because he did not want them to die from cholera. He stole her away, though she did not want to leave. And when word spread that she wanted to come back, some of the elders in the community, we kidnapped her back. He came back and he threatened Erik. Erik hid in the cellar. He kidnaps his wife again and he takes them to Chicago. Well, we had friends in Chicago. And the telegraph was sent that Charlotta was in Chicago and she wanted to come home. And so we organized a series of horses, like the Pony Express. And we kidnapped Charlotta. We put her on a fast horse. She raced to another fast horse, another fast horse. When John Root woke up the next morning and wondered, where is my wife? Where is my son? He thought, I can catch up to a young woman with a child. But he was not fast enough to eat her dust. When he came here to find his wife, we would not give her up. And so he went to Cambridge and he organized a mob. He filled their heads with lies because Joseph Smith had recently been murdered and the Mormons had been chased out of Illinois. Even though the Governor Ford, had promised to protect him, Governor Ford looked the other way as he was murdered. It was easy for John Root to spread similar lies in Cambridge, to speak ill of our community. And so a mob came with torches and pitchforks to burn down the town. We met them at the northern edge of the village. We greeted them not with force, but with kindness. We answered their questions. We dispelled the myths. We invited them to fika, to tea and cookies. And the mob quickly dispelled. But then, John Root curses Erik Janson and says, you will get yours. You will meet your maker, even if it is at my own hand. Now, because I had been the one who had kidnapped Charlotta, who had confronted him repeatedly, it was felt that maybe I should leave for my own protection. It was also at this time, because of the debt with the doctor taking our livestock, and the debt that we had to buy more livestock, the gold rush was opening. And so 9 of us left to travel west. We traveled first to Rock Island, and then we headed across Iowa. We met a party coming back from the gold rush who warned us to be careful with our cash, to be protective of our lives. They discouraged us to go. But it was about the same time we met another party from Wisconsin that was heading west, and we decided to throw in with them. It was March. On the 3rd day of the journey, it began to snow. The next day, we traveled a mean road in a black rain. We arrived at Council Bluffs and crossed the Missouri. And I tell you, if every dead horse and ox, every discarded wagon or piece of furniture were lined up in an even row, you could walk from Council Bluffs to California without ever touching the ground. Many men went seeking their fortune and lost their lives. If not to cholera and disease, it was starvation or privation or the Indians' arrows as we illegally crossed land that was protected in treaties and theirs. When we arrived in California, the shopkeepers charged more for one egg than you could buy a coop of chickens, a stick of butter. They all sang the glories of the gold rush, that you could come and you could strike it rich, though the only profits that were made were by the shopkeepers and the innkeepers. We never struck it rich. But I did meet a Swede by the name of Stoneberg. He had struck it rich, and I convinced him to join our community, and he helped to pay off some of our debt. So maybe that's the gold I was sent to find. But no sooner had I left than Erik Janson was at the Cambridge courthouse trying to settle our debt. John Root was in the nearby courtroom for some nefarious deed. John Root hears Erik Janson's voice. He burst into the courtroom. He took a pistol from the sheriff and he shoots Erik Janson point blank 3 times into the chest, the heart, the lungs, and he falls dead. John Root is arrested. Erik's corpse is brought here. There were some who heard that word when he changed from being a prophet to being the prophet, whose faith was so strong that they sat by his grave for 3 days, fully expecting him to rise. And when that did not happen, the community was thrown into an upheaval. Erik had hoped that his son would take the helm of the community, but his son was 10 years old. His wife tried to position herself as the leader, and a telegraph was sent to San Francisco. And when I received word, I jumped on a ship at San Francisco Bay, and I sailed along the Pacific coast to Panama. I walked through the jungle, across the Panamanian Isthmus, from the Pacific to the Caribbean shore. I boarded another ship and sailed across the Caribbean to New Orleans. I boarded a steamboat that brought me up the Mississippi, up the Illinois to Peoria. From Peoria, I rode a carriage on the Galena Trail. When I arrived here, I arranged that I could take control with a council of 7. And the council of 7 incorporated the town as a business. In our papers of incorporation, I would like to think that my inspiration came from Thomas Jefferson in the founding of this nation. I think maybe Jefferson would appreciate these words, going a few steps beyond our Constitution. From the Articles of Incorporation, I wrote, "Our property and industry and the proceeds thereof shall constitute a common fund, by and with which it shall be the duty of the Board of Trustees to provide for the sustenance, comfort, and reasonable wants of every member of the colony, for the support of the aged and infirmed, for the care and the cure of the sick and the burial of the dead, and for the proper education of our children, and generally to do and transact any and all business necessary to the prosperity, happiness, and usefulness of the colony, consistent with the charter of Bishop Hill." This was our ideal. This is what we strive to build. And we built everything you see around us. Some of it even after the demise of Erik. We built the school, which still stands. We built a hospital. larger than our needs. We serve the surrounding community, ensuring the education and the well-being of the broader community. Our businesses continued to grow. It was then that the businessmen from Philadelphia, New York, St. Louis, and Chicago came to buy brooms, linen, and rugs. When the railroads offered to come through, we thought the railroads might bring riffraffs. And so we pushed the railroad a little further east, and we founded the town of Galva. We named Galva for the port where we had sailed from because it became our port. And many of those buildings you see today were brick made by Bishop Hillians. And our businesses continued to grow. But we never completely paid off our debts. And there was an economic downturn, I think you would say, an economic crisis. And the paper money that we had printed had lost value. And then the Civil War began. And many of our young men, they marched off to war. They joined the Union Army to fight for the freedoms for which this nation stands for. Company D served in every major battle in the Western Theater. From Belmont, Missouri, south, to Fort Henry and Donaldson, to Shiloh, the March on Vicksburg, Raymond and Chancellorsville, the Red River Campaign, all the way to New Orleans. And then they marched overland and they joined Sherman at Chickamauga and Chickasaw Mountain and Kennesaw Mountain. They fought at Atlanta and they marched to the sea. These men risked their lives, and many, because they were the knife blade that Sherman and Grant used to slice through enemy lines, gave their lives for the freedoms this nation stands for. The equality of all men and women. The freedom we came here to seek, to build upon. But at the beginning of the war, when we lost so many young men, and because of the debt that we never fully recovered from, in 1861, we decided to dissolve the community. And every person was given shares. Even women and children were all given shares. Now some families, like my own, who had contributed much and had been founders, we acquired a building or acreage. Some of this is still farmed by the descendants of our family. Others, like the women, one woman was a nurse. She was given a room in the hospital. The nurse's quarters became like her apartment. And she was given 5 acres in the woodlot so she had firewood to warm herself in the winter. Every shirt was counted and divided. Every silver spoon, yes, we had our own silversmith. Every article of material goods was divided fairly among the community members. The community still thrives because of the utopian dream that we have founded on. We still stand together and we work together. And it is a great honor that you have invited me to speak at your semi-demi-septicentennial. And I hope I can close with the closing words of the speech I delivered at the 50th anniversary. And I hope these words still ring true, knowing that there has been economic and cultural turmoil. I hope that we can work together to protect and preserve what is left and won't be lost. I close my speech then, and I will today, with these words. It would be a great comfort if we in our old age could be spared witnessing the destruction that has recently threatened us. And if our descendants, after we have gone on to our fathers, have nobler things to view when looking back upon a bygone days than a ruined place, intended as a dwelling for the people of God. Vi sold av våra hemmen, vi sold av våra hemmen. We sold our homes in Sweden and sailed away from friends. Like the bird that wings on southward when summer slowly ends, it returns in the springtime to nest upon the strand. But we will never once again see our dear motherland. No, we will never once again see our dear motherland. Vi sold av våra hemmen, vi sold av våra hemmen, we sold our homes in Sweden. So were any of you here for the 50th anniversary? How many descendants of the founders of this community do we have present today? I'm glad to see at least one. Any questions about the origins, about the early days? What would you like to know?
What was the attitude of other residents of Henry County when you arrived with the other settlers?
When we arrived, this was the Western Wilderness. And we had very few neighbors. Cambridge had already been founded. And actually, to hear more about the opinions of our neighbors, in November, Benjamin Dunn Walsh will speak. But I will tell you this much. When Erik was murdered and John Root was held in prison, Benjamin Dunn Walsh wrote a letter to the governor. He was one of the founders of Cambridge, from Cambridge, where he was a professor. And he wrote a letter asking for the pardon of John Root. And the governor granted that pardon. He argued that it was a lover's dispute and that his wife had been stolen from him. And he wrote disparagingly of the community. And I'll answer that in more detail maybe in November. But that gives you a general idea. Yes? The Cambridge Courthouse, Henry County Courthouse. You know, I think the courthouse there today was built shortly after our 50th anniversary. So it's not the one that's standing, but more or less the same site. Yes?
How old were you when you sold everything and left Sweden?
I was still a young man. I was 94 at the 50th anniversary. So I was 44 when I left Sweden. Yes?
You say something about the religious life of the community after Janson's death and your role in it.
That is a most excellent question. Thank you for asking. For those who didn't hear, she's asking about the religious life of the community after the death of Erik Janson. Now, because of my background with the Swedish Methodists, one of the first churches built in town, still standing, where churches still served, is a Methodist church. Some of the followers moved to Pleasant Plains, Kentucky, because they wanted to maintain that more religious life. A handful joined the Shakers. Many of us became Seventh-day Adventists, knowing that soon our Lord would return as predicted in the Bible and the second coming. And so we were split not evenly. A small percentage went to Kentucky, a few became Methodist, but I believe more joined the Seventh-day Adventists, and I became a minister and served every Sunday offering services and preaching to the community. Yes?
So how did they establish initially their land base? Was that a homesteading thing, or what was that?
The land was purchased. Originally 20-something acres. The region had recently opened because of the treaty with the Potawatomi after the construction of the I&M Canal. A lot of this land was opened, and the Potawatomi Trail runs just north of here.
Could you speak a little more about the relationship with Galva?
With Galva. Okay, because we are living in America, we do use the English enunciation. Gävle in Sweden, Galva in Illinois. And so some of the first businesses in Galva were actually extensions of Bishop Hill. And when the railroad came through, that's how we shipped 1,000 brooms and miles of rugs. And a lot of Swedes who left the community, when the community dissolved, simply moved to Galva and built their businesses there. So John Root's son became a very successful lawyer in Galva, and John Root's son helped to found the Bishop Hill Old Settlers Association, which has hosted our 50th anniversary and invited me to speak. Olaf Kranz, our most famous painter, he served as a house painter, painting interiors. One of his specialties was taking cheap wood and painting the grain to look like more expensive wood. Taking wood and painting it to look like marble. Creating faux finishes. And I understand there are still a dozen houses in Galva that treasure those faux finishes, knowing it was painted by Olaf Kranz. So a lot of the businesses in Galva grew as a direct extension of Bishop Hill. And I should also maybe say, we sent letters back. Some of what you just heard was quoted from some of those letters that we sent to Sweden. And there are many Swedes who did not want to join the Utopian community, but they were drawn by the land and the opportunity. And so Augustana College might have been in Galva, and that's why the park is preserved. And so a lot of the Swedes at Augustana and Rock Island, Rockford, in St. Paul, Minneapolis, in Quincy, and in Lindsborg, Kansas, huge wave of Swedes came because of the letters that were sent home from Bishop Hill. How many of you are Swedish? Maybe you could visit the Vasa and see what your connection is, whether you're a direct descendant or you're someone who came because of those letters. Thank you very much for listening.